We're roughly at the midway point in Mists of Pandaria Classic, and I thought it was time to check in on how tanks are doing in this Vengeance-fueled expansion. In this video, we'll go over my thoughts on tanking in Mists of Pandaria, how to properly play a tank in MOP, and a tier list for both 10 and 25, now that we've had 6 months of experience to properly examine the relative strength of the different tanks. As a tank, you should make sure to come join us in the Discord. It is, in my completely unbiased opinion, the best tanking community in Mists of Pandaria, filled with biz lists, rate tips, and some of the best tanks in the world giving out their free advice. Click the link in the description to become part of that. And with that, let's take a look at tanking in Mists of Pandaria. If I only had one sentence to recap MOP tanking, then it would be this: very high highs, but extremely low lows. I was super excited to tank in Mists of Pandaria going into the expansion, especially after reflecting back on those childhood memories of Kungen doing 1 million DPS at Windlord. As a little side note, it is absolutely hilarious how low this number is when comparing to what the modern player base can do. That initial excitement, to me at least, is not quite there anymore. I love it in theory, as it allows for so much creativity as a tank. I think I give my raid leader nightmares every time a Discord notification pops up with a message from me reading, "Hear me out, what if?" However, the best way to play around Vengeance often leads to a perverted playstyle, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Throne of Thunder. Aiming to take as much damage as possible is one thing. I don't think it's as big of a deal as you may think, as most tanks scale defensively with Vengeance, meaning that they can become quite self-sufficient even while taking an extreme amount of damage. The biggest issue, in my opinion, is that it relies on other people to accommodate and play around the active tank. To play properly around Vengeance, you will need to have a second tank who is okay with not being the one abusing Vengeance. You need to deploy special tactics, which may or may not make the fight harder, and in a lot of environments, you'll want to have as many adds as possible hitting you, meaning that you need to ask your DPSers to not use AoE abilities. This is fine in a lot of circumstances, but it's a tough ask when you play an Enhancement Shaman, Windwalker Monk, Fire Mage, and the like who incorporates heavy AoE as part of their single target rotation. Even if there are ways to forego using AoE on these specs for the greater good of the raid, it still feels bad for the people who have to alter their playstyle, and it creates this weird dynamic between the tank and the rest of the raid, and that gets old real quick. That said, it's not all doom and gloom. Like I said, Vengeance can be a lot of fun, and boy, the dopamine from a pull where everything works out perfectly is unbeatable. I think the main win in MOP tanking, however, is the added self-reliance and active mitigation playstyle. If you die as a tank in MOP, there is a pretty good likelihood that it was because you misplayed, which I love. Incoming healing of course still matters a lot, but when compared to previous iterations of the game, you no longer solely have to rely on your healers taking good care of you. So how do you actually tank in Mists of Pandaria? Well, let's talk about Vengeance a bit. As you probably know, Vengeance gives you 1.8% attack power of the damage you take. This is a pre-mitigation value, so using defensive cooldowns will not reduce the amount of Vengeance you gain. Actually, quite the opposite is true. There are a lot of strategies to employ where you take additional damage, whether it be by taking more stacks of a dot than may be intended, or keeping adds alive for the purpose of giving Vengeance, and in these scenarios, a tank will need to carefully plan his defensives to survive. Every tank will have their own defensives, but making use of external cooldowns will be vitally important. Vigilance, Handle Sacrifice, and Pain Suppression are the main defensives, but don't neglect to use things such as Guardian Spirit or Life Cocoon just because they're less powerful. Additionally, there are a lot of encounters where the raid can spare raid-wide cooldowns, and particularly in situations where you get capped on Vengeance, Rallying Cry can be used effectively for both increasing your likelihood of staying alive, but also extending the Vengeance cap, granting you upwards of 200,000 extra attack power. Because of the amount of external cooldowns, announcing every single defensive you want over voice comms can be quite frustrating for both you and the raid leader. So what I have found to be by far the best solution in MOP is to install method raid tools and enabling the click to send notification feature. This will send a message to the person you want the cooldown from, and if they have a weak aura, it will give them a large notification that you want their defensive. Both my MRT profile and notification weak aura are linked in the My Resources tab on the Discord. Also, you know how it says that Vengeance is not granted when you're standing in persistent area of effect damage on the ground, like standing in fire? Well, that is not true. There are spells that work like that for sure, but generally, standing in damage effect on the ground will grant Vengeance. Being able to identify what grants Vengeance and what doesn't, and then being able to dip in and out of the pools depending on how many cooldowns you have available will greatly increase your throughput. There are a few smaller interactions of note, like the first hit you take after not having tanked for a while will give you 5% Vengeance instead of 1.8, which is great on pull, but also great if you're a warrior who wants some additional Vengeance while not tanking through using Intervene. Taunting of course grants 50% Vengeance, so even if you're funneling Vengeance to the main tank, you can grab quite a lot of attack power by just taunting the boss occasionally. Be careful not to over-taunt, however, as almost every single boss in MOP becomes taunt immune for a period of time after taunting too much. Damage taken from Blessing of Sacrifice does not grant Vengeance, and when it comes to debuffs on you, you get additional Vengeance when it's a percent damage taken increase, but not when it's a percent armor reduction. All tanks have some form of active mitigation which they should track, and since the introduction of TOT, pretty much every boss has some tank buster which you should aim to have active mitigation up for. Additionally, most tanks also have a secondary effect to track which is affected by Vengeance. Paladins, for example, should try to snapshot their Sacred Shield with as high Vengeance as possible, and should not be afraid to refresh Sacred Shield if it means a stronger snapshot, even if they have a long duration left on the previous application. There are a ton of things that tanks can do to either tilt defensively or offensively when it comes to both gearing and rotation. However, keep in mind that not all trades are considered equal. For example, the DPS Legendary Metagem is a pretty substantial DPS increase, but it does come at a pretty large defensive cost. If you're a tank who is progressing, you should most likely opt for the defensive Metagem. However, even if you are progressing, you'll want to prioritize things such as parry, dodge, and haste over stats such as stamina on Blood Death Knight, as it's a much more efficient trade-off. Rotationally, a lot of classes will have these trade-offs as well, like Protection Paladin, who can deprioritize Crusader Strike to gain DPS at the cost of active mitigation uptime. On bosses like Jinrock, where you don't really care much for the incoming damage, this can be a very efficient trade to make. Also, don't forget about the basics. Almost every log that I review has large moments of downtime in their rotation. Usually this is because they don't plan out their movement while failing to incorporate ranged abilities. Utilize Nitro Boots, Priest Feathers, Priest Life Grips, Goblin Gliders, etc. to make sure that you have as high uptime as possible on your target. Similarly, keep your raid in mind while positioning as well. It may sound good in theory to drag something to its new position with a provoke from a monk, but that will likely lead to melee DPSers falling behind and losing uptime. Unless there's some major benefit to moving the boss quickly, like on Lei Shen in phase 1 and 2, or Protectors in Terrace, then make sure your melees can keep up with the boss. And lastly, for the love of God, don't neglect your UI. It's vitally important to have everything, including your health bar, centralized on the screen without too much clutter. Your central HUD should at the very least include your health bar, resources, active mitigation uptime, vengeance, defensive cooldowns, and rotational abilities. If you are tracking cooldowns at the top left corner, like a lot of people do, I would try to bring it down to be more centered. Alright, so the tier list. How do I think each tank stacks up in MOP Classic so far? While I have been down on a few specs in the past, I think the classes are all quite balanced and each caters to a certain situation. I'll break it down into 10 and 25 man, and please stick around for the explanation why I put the classes in each tier, as I think these lists can be quite misleading when lacking the context. Let's start with 25 man. I place Prot Warrior and Prot Pally in S tier, Bear and Brew in A tier, and Blood DK in B tier. There are some very important caveats here though. Protection Warrior and Protection Paladin are only as high as they are if you play around Vengeance. If you don't, then they fall to an A or maybe even B tier. Bear is more of an A+, while Brew is more of an A-, and if you are in a raid that's funneling Vengeance, Brew becomes B or even a C tier tank, as they cannot funnel single target damage without killing everything around it, and as an off-tank, they can't press their abilities without griefing the main tank's vengeance. Blood Death Knight is a B-tier pick during progression, but once they get gear, especially the 2 and 4 set DPS set, while comfortably being able to run Cinder Glacier on their weapon, they turn into absolute beasts on certain fights, making them more of an A-tier pick. They are still quite battle funneling, but with Warcraft logs not allowing bringing trash into the boss, this becomes less of a problem. In 10 man, this list becomes flipped on its head. Brewmaster S, Bloody K, Bear, and Prot Pal A, and Prot Warrior B. Brewmaster is only really S from a progression perspective, or if the raid can afford to drop a healer because of the raid guards. They suffer the same issues as in 25 man during reclears, that they scale poorly with vengeance and can't funnel DPS without killing everything around it. Blood Death Knight becomes arguably the strongest tank due to their high DPS with lower vengeance, while Bear and Prot Pal both have their moments to shine. Prot Warrior suffers a bit in 10 man as they require high vengeance to really excel. Not having self-sustain is no big deal in 25 man, but in 10 man, it becomes quite detrimental. The fact that every tank is relevant and can specialize at their own certain tasks is kinda cool. And while I'm not always the biggest fan of the balancing changes, it is really cool to be able to play whatever tank you want without getting a major case of FOMO. Also, keep in mind that these lists change all the time, and I'll do my best to keep you guys up to date on my thoughts on balancing prior to Siege of Orgrimmar coming out. Like I mentioned earlier, the best place to get information on tanking in MOP is through the Discord, and if you want to grab any of the resources I displayed in this video, then that's where you'll grab that. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.